It's good to have you back and to welcome you to your very first challenge of this section. And in this one, we will continue building on the code that we already built in the HTML fundamentals section. So after our first big challenge, we ended up with this code. So with this project here, remember? And so what I want you to do now is to build on this project in order to achieve this, basically. So here you see that we have some text in uppercase, this one, this one. There is some gray background color between this heading. You also see that there are some special styles here. This text is way larger. The button is styled like this. So when we hover it, and also the link is styled differently. There is a big black border around the entire component. So this entire article element. And I think that's it. Also, these list icons here are now square. And to achieve this, you can experiment with different values of the list style property. But this one is also not really important. So what's really important is this hover style. So basically the link on itself is black. And then once we hover it, all that happens is that the underline disappears. Then down here, remember that this is actually a button element. And buttons can also have hover states. Now, unlike links, they do not have the link or visited pseudo class, but you can still specify styles for the hover pseudo class. And so what I want you to do is that when we hover this button, is basically to invert the colors. So the background was black and now it's white, and the text was white before, and now it is black. So a nice effect like this. And don't really worry about the correct colors and about the correct font sizes here. So just use any values for now, because my goal with this is that you really practice the properties themselves, and the values are not really what matters. Okay? So as a starting point for this challenge, please use the code that you ended up with after your last coding challenge. So after the end of the HTML fundamentals section. And if for some reason you don't have that code anymore, or if you didn't do that challenge, then I will also include a link in this video where you can find the starter code so that you can start working from there. So this is kind of a big challenge, so it should take you at least probably half an hour, maybe a bit more, to finish this. And it's not a problem at all if you have to go back to the code that we wrote together during the lectures. So you don't have to have memorized all of the property names at this point. It's completely normal if you need to look some of them up. Okay? So don't feel bad for doing that. What I want you to do is to write some CSS on your own, and I'm sure that you will do that. So see you back here once you are ready. Welcome back, and I hope that you had a great time solving this challenge and that you had a lot of fun. And let's not waste any time and get to work right away. And I will start with the body, and I will give it a sans serif font family. So sans serif. And so as we learned in the last lecture, this font family set to sans serif will now be inherited to all of the other elements. All right? And so that already in itself is a big change. Now, another thing that I want to do here, and this one was not mandatory for you because I actually didn't even mention it, but I want to increase the line height here. And this is another one of those properties that actually does get inherited. And by adding some line height here between all the elements, we get a little bit more breathing space here between especially this li elements. Okay, and now let's simply start working from the top to the bottom of this HTML code here. So starting with the article, we'll start by adding that black border around it. So here, let's give it a class of product. And I will now start using classes on every single element. But once again, you wouldn't have to do it exactly that way. So if your result looks the same as mine, then there is no need to change anything. All right, so I used a 4 pixel here. Maybe used something else, but that's not really important. Okay, nice. Now here we have this h2, so I'm calling that the product title. So product title, and let's take a look here. So the text is in the center, there is this background color, and it is uppercase. So let's do that. Text align of center, a font size, let's say of 22 pixels. Then it was also uppercase, right? So that's text transform uppercase. And finally that subtle background color that we had. And I will use again the one from the lectures, F7, F7, F7. And indeed, that looks quite nice. And so let's move on to the next one. Let's just add some comments here to make it easier to understand. And here in CodePen, actually the exact same shortcut works as in VS Code. So that's Command or Control slash. All right. So next up, let's make the text a little bit bigger, and let's also change this free shipping label here. So you see that, yeah, the price is bigger, and then this free shipping here is kind of just a label, right? And this will actually make a bit more sense once we transform this into a nice layout. But what matters is that the text is quite small and uppercase and a lighter gray. So let's do all of that now. So this one is called price and this one shipping. So notice how I'm doing this quite fast here at this point because we already learned about all of these properties, and I'm really just trying to solve the challenge here together with you, which you hopefully already did on your own before. So this is more like to review most of the stuff that we already did before. So I'm calling this kind of section of our code here product information, and then price. And here, let's say we want a font size of 24 pixels. Nice. And now as for the shipping, so shipping, and also notice how I'm only ever using classes and never IDs. And so again, that's to basically future-proof our code, such as I explained in one of the earlier lectures in this section, right? So the font size here is a bit on the small side, so 12 pixels. Remember that's uppercase. And now what else do we have? The font weight was also bold. And let's see what else. Yeah, we have this like lighter color. So let's use a 777 here. And this color you could have like come up with in the VS Code color picker, right? For me, this value is just already like a default in my head when I need a lighter gray color. And for you, of course, this will also come with practice. All right. Now, anyway, let's move on to the link here. So that's this one here. Calling this one more info. So more info. And now remember that this is a link and it does have a href property. And so therefore, here we should now use the link pseudo class. Okay, so that's the best practice, always to actually style the different link states. So the only thing that actually changes is the color, which should become black, if I remember it correctly. Right. And the hover state is the same, with the only difference that the underline is gone. And the same for the active. So I just clicked and it still looks the same. So let's translate that into code. So hover. And now what I said is that text decoration is none. And I also said that the same is true for the active. And so instead of just copying this rule, I can just copy the selector and do this as a list. So I want this to happen on hover and on active. And hopefully you notice that we are actually missing one of the states. And so let's simply add that here. So that's the visited state. So I mentioned before that we should always specify all the 4 states and always in this order. So first link, then visited, then hover, and then active. And in this case, the link and the visited state happen to be the same, and the same goes for hover and active. And so that works nicely, just as expected. Okay. So this section here of the code is basically the product information. And now down here we have kind of the product details. So all of this here, we can call it product details. So let's add like another separator here inside of our code. And so this is nice to visually divide our code into different sections. Here we have the details title. And then let's call the list the details list. Okay, let's grab this from here so we don't have to write it all over again. And then here the list. And actually let's start with that. So I told you to experiment a little bit with the list style property, which doesn't really work here in CodePen. I mean, the experimenting, because the values do not show up like they do in VS Code. But maybe you did it in VS Code, and there you could see that one of the options is to set it to square. And so then it looks like this. So it fits nicely the rest of our kind of boxy layout here. Okay, and then here, the product details, let's just make it uppercase like the other heading. So text transform uppercase and a font size of 16 pixels. Okay, beautiful. That looks already almost the same, except here for the button. And so that should be easy as well. So let's create a new section here just for the button. And in this very small piece of code, now of course it wouldn't be necessary to do it like this, so to add all of these comments here, but I just want you to start to get into the habit of organizing your own code a little bit. Okay. So this button here, I'm calling it add card. And now let's start with the background color set to black. Let's see. But now we get this very ugly border that you see here. So I don't know if we actually did this before. Probably we didn't. So it's not a big deal, of course, if you didn't do this part here. So setting the border to none. But anyway, the color we should set to white. And so we can do that using the CSS color name, or we could of course do the hex code, so the hexadecimal notation of FFF, which is exactly the same thing. Then let's make it a bit bigger. Font size 20 pixels. And again, a text transform of 20, well, not of 20 pixels, of course, but of uppercase. Nice. So I think that looks the same. And now we just need the opposite, basically. Oh, and we also need to add like this cursor here. So this pointer, so the hand, because usually on a button that doesn't appear by default. So this is certainly a property I didn't show you before, but let me show it to you now. So we can set the cursor to pointer. And so now it looks like a link. So you see, now we have the hand here, just like we had here. Great. And now, as I told you before, you can now set the hover pseudo class. All right, because this is a button and we can of course hover it. And so we can specify the hover pseudo class. And actually we can do that on all elements, but usually it doesn't make a lot of sense. So anyway, all we want to do here is basically to invert the colors. So now the color should be black. And to keep it consistent, let's use the hexadecimal notation. And the same here. So I like to keep things consistent in this way. And then the background color should now be white. Okay, and indeed that works. So I think that with this, our project here now looks exactly the same as the demo code. Great. So I hope that wasn't too hard and that you had some fun and that you were able to do at least some of it. So in case you need to compare your code with mine, I will include a link to the final code of this challenge somewhere into this lecture. And with that being said, I see you in the next lecture, which is one of the most important ones of this section. The CSS box model is one of the most fundamental parts of CSS, and so you really need to understand it in order to learn CSS, and so that is exactly what we will do in this video. Now, what exactly is the box model? Well, the box model defines how elements are displayed on a web page and how they are sized. So in this box model, each and every element on a web page can be seen as a rectangular box. And each of these boxes can have content, a border, and space inside and outside of it. So let's define all of the pieces of the box model one by one. And starting with the content, this is the actual content of the element. So it can be text, or images, or a table, a video, or really any other content that we might specify. Using CSS properties, we can specify both the height and the width of the content area, which we will do in one of the next lectures. Next, we can define a border that goes all around the element. And actually, we already did that before, remember? And by the way, this border is technically still inside of the element. And now the next ingredient of the box model is the padding. So padding is basically invisible white space that we can create around the element's content. So between the content and the border. You can see that nicely in this diagram, and it will make even more sense when we start using this in practice. But anyway, just like the border, the padding is also still inside of the element. So essentially, padding is empty space that we can create inside of elements. Then, similar to padding, we also have margin. Now the difference is that margin creates empty space around the element. so outside of the element itself. So in practice, we use margin in order to create space between elements on our page. So if, for example, we want space between two certain elements, we simply specify the margin property on one of them. So again, padding is empty space that we can add inside of any element. It will sit between the content itself and the border, which is basically the outermost part of the element. So the content, padding, and border all together are the visible part of the element as we can see it on the page. Then around all that, we can add some margin in order to create space between elements. Now, what's important to note here is that all of these are actually optional. So we don't have to specify paddings or a border or margins. So we can define none of them or some or even all of them. It all depends on how we want our layout to look like. Finally, there is also something called the fill area. And this one can be a bit confusing, but let's try to understand it. So remember that the text content and images are inside the content box, right? Now, the same does not apply for background images or the background color of an element. These properties will actually be applied not only to the content area, but to the entire fill area, which also includes the padding and the border. So basically, if we apply a background image or color, it will occupy the entire visible part of the element. Now, for some people, this can all sound very abstract and hard to imagine in the real world. And so in these situations, it's very useful to think of an analogy in the real world. And one analogy that I personally find very helpful is to imagine a frame on a wall. So in this analogy, the drawing or the image that is in the frame is the content area. Then many frames actually have this kind of white paper between the drawing or the image and the actual frame itself. And so if we bring that back to our box model, then that would of course be the padding. So the space between the content area and the border. And so in this analogy, the frame is of course the border, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Finally, when we hang a picture on the wall using a frame like this, then of course there might be some space between other elements on the wall or even some other walls on the sides. And so in our box model analogy, that of course would be the margin. So it is the space that is outside of the frame and creating space between frames. So for example, there might be another frame somewhere here on the wall, and the space between those frames, so outside of them, is what we call the margin in the box model. Okay, so hopefully this analogy from the real world helps you bring these concepts back into the more abstract world of CSS. And now, just to finish, let's quickly learn how the box model actually calculates the exact size of an element based on the content, border, and padding. So, as I mentioned, we can specify the height and the width of the content area. Now, if we choose not to define the height or width, then the box model will simply imply them based on the content. However, these specified or implied heights and width are actually not the final sizes of the element. And that's because the border and the padding are also taken into account. So the final width of an element as we see it in the final layout is defined by the left border plus the left padding plus the specified or implied width plus the right padding plus the right border. And the same logic, of course, applies to the height of an element. So it's the top border plus the top padding plus the specified or implied height plus the bottom padding and finally the bottom border. Now, as you can see, the margin is of course not part of the width or height calculations of the elements, because again, it is just space that is around them. And as I said in the beginning of the lecture, we can of course specify all these individual sizes using certain CSS properties. Now, what's very important to note here is that this way of calculating heights and width is actually just the default behavior of the box model. However, we can change this default behavior because it actually doesn't make much sense. And we will do that a bit later, but for now, I don't want to confuse you anymore. And so let's start by using this default behavior starting right in the next video. In this video, let's start applying the box model in practice, and in particular, margins and paddings. And let's start with padding. And one great candidate for adding some padding is this header element here, which has this background color. So an element which has background color can always use some padding in order to create some space between the content and the outside of an element. That's because, remember, padding is basically just space that is inside of the element. So this element is called the main header, and I think we have it somewhere down here. And indeed, here it is. Now, actually, what I want to do is to take this code here, which is for these boxes, and put it a bit more to the top. So I like to have like these big level boxes, so boxes that contain multiple child elements more at the top. All right, so this header here is kind of the first of these big boxes, and so I will put it here right after the body. All right, but now let's start by adding some padding. So we use the padding property, and then we need to specify some length. So let's use 20 pixels. And so pixels is exactly the same unit that we also used for the border width and also for font sizes. Remember? So let's see what that looks like. And indeed, we now got ourselves some new space that is between the content, so between all of this, and of course the outside of the element. Now it looks like the space here is the same as here, so it's 20 pixels, but then here there's a lot more space. So let's right click here on this element and inspect. And so here you see the reason for that. So when we hover over an element, we actually get the margin of that element. And so that is that red or that orange overlay. All right. And now the header itself, you see the green space there, that is the padding. Okay. So you see that in fact, the padding goes all around the box or all around the inside of the box, and it is really 20 pixels everywhere. Okay. So we will fix this margin here in a second, and by then everything will make sense. Okay. Now actually down here in these styles, we can see the box model, right? And so here we see that indeed there is a padding of 20 everywhere. So on all four sides. So this one here is actually the width and the height, then the padding, then the border, and then the margin. So for each element, there is a complete representation of the box model right here in the DevTools. And many times, this is extremely helpful. So we will use this for sure a bit later. Now, this padding here does create the same padding on all four sides of the box. But if we wanted to create different paddings on different sides, we can do that also just very easily. So let's say we wanted different paddings at the left and right. So we can say, for example, 40 pixels on the left and on the right. And so this is in fact exactly the same thing as with the border. So remember, with the border, we also have border top, border bottom, left and right. Okay. And now indeed, there's a lot more space here on the left side than on the bottom. And the same here on the right side, even though we cannot really see it by the content, but we can see it here using the DevTools, right? So you see that here on the right, we have 40, 40 on the left, and then 20 on top and on bottom. All right. But now we can actually write this in an even better way by using something called a shorthand once again. So a shorthand is always when we specify multiple values here for one property. So for padding, what we can do is to, instead of just specifying one value, which will then be the same on all four sides, we can specify two values. And if we do that, then the first value will be the padding on the top and bottom, and the second value will be the padding on the left and right side. So to achieve the same result as before, we would say 20 pixels and 40 pixels. And so if we now removed this code here like this using a comment, then our result is still the same. Okay, so we used this shorthand to add 20 to top and bottom and 40 to left and right. And this way we don't have to write all of these different lines of codes here. We can just do it all in one go. Next up, let's play a little bit with margins. And remember that margins are basically spaces between elements. So let's now add some space between the li elements. So these ones here. You see that they're very close together and it doesn't look nice. And therefore we can add some margin to the bottom of each of these elements. So somewhere down here there must, so there is the li already. So we don't need to select it over and over again. We just write it here inside the same rule. And so let's say margin to the bottom 10 pixels. And so now that does look a lot better, right? Let's select this here. And indeed, we get 10 pixels at the margin bottom on each of them. Just scroll to the last one because now I want to show you something. So usually in the last list item, we don't want to have any space because we actually only want space between the items, but not at the end of the items. So again, the last one should not have any space. And so let's use a trick for that, which is actually something that we learned before. So we can say li and then last child. And then here we basically reset what we just did. So we say margin bottom and set it to 0. And whenever we use 0, we do not specify any unit. Okay, so we just say 0 and that will then override it. And now that space that we had here before should be gone. So you see, this one has no margin, but the one before it, that does have these 10 pixels at the bottom. Nice, that's beautiful. And we will now keep adding more and more margins and paddings to all of our elements. But before we do that, we should actually do something called a global reset. So if you take a look at our page here, and let's close this, then you notice that there are actually already a lot of spaces here, right? So there's space around this H2 element here, between the paragraphs. Also here, as we saw before using the DevTools, there was a lot of margin on the top and bottom of this H1. And having all of these default margins and paddings makes it quite hard for us to style our page. So what we want to do is to reset all those margins and paddings and basically set them to 0. So how do you think we can do that? Do you think we should use inheritance? So do you think that margin and padding get inherited from one element to the other? Well, let's test and set the margin to 0. So let's see. And well, something actually did change. So the body lost the margin that it had. So now everything is really like glued to the border here, so to the border of the viewport, so the browser itself, but not all the elements lost its margin, right? And so this is not really the way to go, because margin is not a property that is related to text, and therefore it's not a property that gets inherited from parents to child elements. Instead, if we want the margin to be applied to every single element, then for that we can use the universal selector. So margin set to 0 and padding set to 0. And now this is exactly the result that we were looking for. So now all the default spaces are gone and we are free to format our page as we wish. And doing something like this here, so this kind of global reset, is extremely common. So this is usually the very first thing that I do whenever I start any new project. And also keep in mind that this margin and padding here are extremely easy to overwrite. So every other selector will actually override this universal selector. And in fact, we can see that right here in the main header where we did specify some padding. And so of course it is still visible here. Okay, so once again, this class selector here has a higher priority than the global selector. And in more technical terms, we say that the universal selector has a specificity of 0, which is what VS Code shows us here in this tooltip, while on the other hand, this selector here does have the 1 in one of these places. So this one is more specific. It has a higher priority, and therefore the padding does get applied. And the same is true also right here in this list. So here we also already should have the 10 pixels that we just specified previously. Okay, and now with this reset in place, it is extremely easy to now add our custom spaces and make this page really look designed. And since we're already here, let's actually start here with the aside, or keep going here. Because once again, this is one of the elements which has a background color. And so therefore, in order to create some space, we should use padding, because otherwise this border here is really glued to the content. So that's not what we want. So let's say padding top of 50 pixels and padding bottom of also 50 pixels. Let's give it a save, and that looks a lot better. So for now, we're leaving left and right side at 0, and we will fix that a bit later. So how could we write this here actually in a bit better way? Well, I hope you guessed it, and the answer would be to use the shorthand. So just padding at the top and bottom, which is the first value of 50 pixels, and the second value is left and right, where we want 0. And that's it. So take these out, give it a save, and it still does look the same. Okay. Now let's go up to the top of the page. And now here we probably need some space between this header and this H2 element here, right? So this looks very bad. And so we need some space outside of this element here. So between these two. And for that, we can use a margin bottom below basically this header element. So let's come here to our main header and add a margin bottom of, let's say, 60 pixels. And it is in fact very common to use mostly space at the bottom in order to create vertical space. Okay, so just stick to either margin top or always margin bottom. So one of them is fine, but it's best not to always mix them when you want to create space between elements. And personally, I really like to use margin bottom. It makes a lot of sense in my mind to do it like this. Okay, and let's keep going and maybe add some space now below this H2. So H2 is right here. So let's say a margin at the bottom once again, and here we just use 30 pixels. And again, these values here are quite random, and later we will use a system to automatically basically create these values for us. Next, let's create some space here between this part, so basically this image, and then the rest of the content. And if we take a look at our markup, that part, so this image, this author, and this other image here is this header. So let's add some margin bottom to this header, and so I'm giving it another name. So this one is the main header, so let's call this one here the post header. So let's copy that here, put it here, and then margin bottom of 40 pixels. So that's a lot nicer. Next, I want to think about the paragraphs because, well, this looks very messy right now. And so just by adding some space to the bottom of each paragraph, that will make it a lot better immediately. So margin bottom, and let's try 15 pixels here. And indeed, that is a lot better already. Now the same with these lists. So now here in this ordered list and this unordered list that we have here, now actually the numbers and the bullet points are gone. And that is because we actually need some space on the left side so that they can be shown. So let's add them back because our global reset basically removed all those spaces. Remember? So we want that space in the unordered list and also in the ordered list. So let's say margin on the left side, for example, 50 pixel. And so now you see that they are back. So everything moved 50 pixels to the right. And so now so the numbers and the bullets are back. Let's also add some space to the bottom. 20 pixels. Okay. And now let's move on to the H3. So that's this one here. So margin bottom 20 pixels. And something is wrong. I cannot spell margin, apparently. So that looks a lot better. And now we also need to specify some distance between this text here and this heading. So right now it looks like the space between these two is exactly the same, and that's not good. And I'm actually doing this because I want to show you something. So I'm going to specify the margin top now and set it to 40 pixels. Okay, now that works beautifully. However, let me now show you something using the DevTools. So I'm inspecting this element. And so you see that there is exactly the 20 pixels that we specified to the bottom and the 40 pixels that we specified to the top. However, this paragraph that comes before it actually also has a margin to the bottom of, I believe, 15 pixels. So this one, right? So right now, this element here has 40 pixels to the top, and this one has 15 pixels to the bottom. And so both of these spaces occupy this area here, right? And so we might intuitively think that these two spaces do get added up. So basically that these 15 pixels here will get added to the 40 pixels that come from here. But in fact, that is not what happens. So we see here that in fact, the distance between the two elements is really just 40 pixels. It is not 55 pixels, okay? And this phenomena is called collapsing margins. So basically when we have two margins that occupy the same space, only one of them is actually visible on the page. And that is usually the larger of the two. So for example, let's say that we specified even like 40 pixels here. Then we might have thought that this was actually 80 pixels here. So following the same logic from before. But of course, it is still only 40 pixels because of the collapsing margins. But what if we had like 100 pixels here? Well, then now the space here would in fact be 100 pixels. So exactly this orange space that you see right there, right? So this one now still has its 40, but this one has 100. And so now the space between them is still not 140, but it's these 100 pixels of the bottom of the P. Okay, so this is what we mean when we talk about collapsing margins, which is something that you might hear once you start hearing people talking about some CSS weird quirks or like weird stuff that is inside of CSS. Okay, and with this, I think we are basically almost done already. Let's just add some more space here between these related posts and all this content here, which is the article, right? So we have the article and yeah, the aside. So we need some space there as well. And I don't think if I already selected the article anywhere, and it looks like I didn't. So let's put that at the top. And since I'm here, I will grab this nav and put it also at the top because it's one of those bigger elements. So I like to keep them at the top. And of course, the same goes for the article. So article and a nice margin bottom of 60 pixels. Okay, and here we go. That's it. That's our page nicely formatted in terms of margins and paddings. So just to quickly recap, whenever you need some space inside of an element, which is very useful mostly when there is a background color or a border on the element, then you always use padding. On the other hand, in order to create space outside of an element, or also to create space between multiple elements, always use margin. And in case that you need to add vertical space, then I advise you to most of the time stick to margin bottom. And so basically that's it about adding space to our page elements. And in the next lecture, we will then also add dimensions, so height and width. So now let me just very quickly show you how we can add dimensions to elements in CSS using the height and the width property. And let's once again start with our aside element down here, which at some point later will be our sidebar. And so it shouldn't be as wide, and instead we only want it to be 500 pixels wide. So we can simply come here to our element and specify the width as 500 pixels. And just like that, now our aside element is only 500 pixels wide. So a lot more narrow than the rest of the page. Okay, so very easy, very straightforward. That is the width property. Let's try another one. So actually, let's try height now. And I'm doing that here in the main header. So here, let's set the height to, let's say, 80 pixels. All right. And now you saw how it increased here, right? Now, let's actually inspect this header here. So not the link, but the entire header element, right? And if we check out the box model down here, so this is all a bit small, but never mind. So you can see that here we actually have the 80 pixels that we just specified, right? And then on top of that, we have the 20 pixels to the top and to the bottom. And so the complete final size of the element is actually not the 80 pixels that we specified here, but it is 80 plus 20 plus 20, which is 120 pixels. So that is exactly that default behavior of the box model that I mentioned before, and that, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense at all. But again, we will fix that a little bit later. For now, it is important to learn how the box model actually works originally. And so again, the real height of this element is not the 80 that we specified here, but we would then have to add the padding to the top and bottom. Okay? Now, one thing that you also might have noticed here is that the content, so the text here, doesn't just magically get vertically centered inside of this header element. So it actually was vertically centered before, but that was simply because we had applied the same padding to both of the sides. But now, not anymore. I mean, we still do have the same padding on both sides, but now we have this other height here. And so now the space that's at the bottom is no longer the space that's at the top. And actually, it's not really straightforward to center this vertically, but of course, we will learn how a little bit later. Okay, so let's close it. And now let's actually finally talk about this image. So up until this point, it has been sitting here untouched, but now let's select it and let's actually size it. And for that, let's give it a class so that we can then select it. So it is this one here. So class of post image, let's say. Copy it and then, well, let's say somewhere here at the very bottom actually. So this here was just a demo, so I'm putting it here. And now let's specify the width here. So it is actually very common to size images in CSS and not in HTML like we did. Actually, many times we never even specify the width of images in HTML, but only in CSS. Now here, for the first time, I will not use a length in pixels. I mean, I could for now, let's say 800 pixels. And so, well, that looks like it actually was the wrong image that we selected here. So the class should be, of course, on this one. And so now that looks correct. And so that 800 that we specified there did now override this 500. However, this 200 here is still in place. And that's why the aspect ratio is now like completely broken. Right, so this doesn't look correct anymore. It's way stretched to the width. And so in order to fix that, in case we do have the height specified in HTML, what we need to do is to then set the height to auto. And so that will then fix it and will put the aspect ratio back to the original. Okay, but again, specifying the height and setting it to auto is only necessary if that height is already specified before in HTML. In case we don't do that, so in case we don't specify any image dimensions in HTML, then if we set the height or the width using CSS, the other one will automatically adapt in order to account for the original aspect ratio of the image. So for example, if we set this to 300, then it would become really small, right? But now, as I said, let's actually move away from pixels for the first time and use percentages. So I can say the width like this, so 100%. And usually for a width measurement like this, the percentage is usually the percentage of the width of the parent container. So the parent of the post image is the header, and this header is basically the entire width of the page, right? And so if I say width of 100%, then this image should now be the width of the entire page. And indeed, that is exactly what we get. And so what's special about this is that now as we change the size of the window, then the size of the image will always stay at 100%. Okay, because that is always the size of the parent container. Of course, we could set it to something else, like half of the size of the parent container. And what would still happen is that as we changed the size of the parent container, then the size of the image would also adapt. Okay, and this is something that will become very, very important once we start talking about building responsive websites. So websites that adapt to the screen width. Okay, but let's put it back to 100%, which is what we originally wanted. And with that, I think we are actually done with setting some heights and some width, at least for now. One of the very first tricks that I learned with CSS was how to center a page inside of the browser. So back in the day, many pages were not centered, and I found it really cool that we could very easily center a page in the browser using a very simple trick. And so let me now share that really nice trick with you in this video. Now, the very first thing that we need to do in order to pull off this trick is to put all of our content into a container element. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, then what is there actually to center in the window? So what I mean is that right now, as we keep resizing the browser window, all of the content actually stretches from one side to the other. So there is no content there to center in the center of the browser, right? So we first need a container, and that container then needs a certain width. So let's put all of this into a box, and this box doesn't need to have any special meaning. So we don't need a semantic HTML element here, and so we can simply use a div element. Now, this one should not close here, but it should close right before the end of the body. So it starts right there, and we close it only here after the footer. And now as I save it, all the indentation should automatically get fixed. And it did. Nice. So this is a really nice thing about Prettier. So when we keep adding other elements, then all the indentation will automatically get fixed, which is really, really helpful. Then here we need to give this a name, and I like to use the name of container. Let's copy that class and style it here. And as I was saying, now we actually need to give this container a width, because otherwise there is not really anything to center. So let's start with 700 pixels, and I'll make it a bit wider later. Okay, so we have this width of 700 pixels now. So you see that now the width of this element, so this header here, which is a child element of the container, is now only 700 pixels as well. So again, this div here has a width of 700, so we can see that here. And so now the child elements which are inside of it can of course not be bigger than that. So they can only be as large as the container element. And so therefore this one is also 600 pixels wide, or actually 700. So that's 620 plus 40 plus 40. Okay. So this has nothing to do like with inheritance or something like that. Instead, it is simply the logic that the child element can never be wider than the parent element. And so if the parent element is 700, then all the others are going to be 700 as well. So this one, for example, is 700, and the H2 as well, and so on and so forth. Right? The same here goes for the image, of course, which is 100% of the parent. And so now as we keep making this bigger, these 700 pixel container here always keep staying on the left side. And so now, as a final step, we need to center this container element inside of the browser. And so that is the actual trick. So giving the container a width is part 1, and now part 2 is to add some margins to the left and to the right of the container. So we can say margin left and then set it to auto, which stands for automatic, and margin to the right, also automatic. So what this means is that the margin on the left needs to be the same than the margin on the right side, and they should both be calculated automatically by the browser. And so therefore, this will mean that there will be a margin on the left and on the right which will be exactly the same size. And therefore, as a result, the container will look centered inside of the body. So basically inside of the browser. So if we give this a save, then it does actually work. Great. This is fantastic. So as we resize, let's see, then the margin on the left and on the right keep growing, and they keep giving us basically this illusion that the page is completely centered, so that the container is centered. So if I inspect this now and go to the container, then here I can see that the margin is right now 180 on both sides. And if I resize this, then you see that now it is only, for example, 72.5 on each side. So again, it is the same on both sides because it is auto on both sides. And auto means that the browser will automatically figure out the width. Okay. Now here, actually, I want this to be 800 pixels, but I put it a bit smaller before because if we then put it like this, we can actually not see anything. So it doesn't look centered. But of course, if we keep growing the window, then now this entire column is nicely centered. Right? So this is a really great trick. And I remember back in the day, like way over 15 years ago, I was really happy when I discovered this trick. Now, just to finish, we can also write this here as a shorthand once again, which is actually even more common. So the margin at the top and the bottom right now is 0, and left and right is auto. And so that is the second value of the shorthand. So we can get rid of this, and there we go. Let's test it again. And indeed, it had to work the same, right? And with this, we finished this nice trick. And also, actually, we finished this part of the section about the box model. And so what this means is that we are now ready for the next part of the coding challenge. So after reviewing this and maybe reviewing this entire file, so how it looks like right now after this part of the section. So once you're done doing that, then let's move on to the next video and start our next coding challenge. So see you there. Let's continue working on our very small shoe article project in this coding challenge number 2. So just like before, use the results of the previous challenge as the starting point for this one. And if for some reason you don't have that code, then as always, I have the starter and the final code links somewhere in this lecture. But it would be better, of course, if you would use your own code, maybe if you have it on CodePen, or if you're doing this challenge on your own computer using VS Code. All right. So we ended up with this result in the last coding challenge. So remember, it was this. And what I want you to do now is to use your new knowledge about the box model to arrive at this result. So you see that this article here, so this element is a lot more narrow now, and it is also nicely centered in the page. So the width of this container here, so this article element, is 825 pixels. Next, you can see that many margins and paddings have been removed, and so that probably means that there has been some global reset here. So do that just like we did in one of the lectures. But then of course keep adding back some paddings and some margins. So whenever you see some space here in this example, for example here inside of this heading, then of course you need to add back some space. And you can do that using margin or padding, as you know, so just choose the right one for the right situation or according to what you learned. Finally, another thing is that this button here now is really wide. So it spans all the way from the left side to the right side. And also it now has this border here at the top, so to create this illusion of a button even when we're hovering it. So see if you can maybe arrive at this result, but if you can't, then that's of course, as always, not a big problem. So just take some time now and really try to code up this challenge, and I see you back here when you are done. Okay, so let's waste no time and start right away. And I will actually start, to give us some more space here. So I will start with that global reset I mentioned. So adding a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 to every single element on the page. All right, and now I will actually make this product here, so this element, I will give it the width of 825 pixels as I had mentioned before. All right, and so now it's time to center this in the browser. And in the last lecture, I actually showed you how to do that. So there we created an element that we called the container, and then we centered that inside of the body. Now in this case, the container is basically this product here, right? And so that is where we add the width, and so that's where we also set now the left and right margins to auto. So I'm using the shorthand here and giving it at the top and the bottom 0, and then left and right auto. And so here we go. Now it is centered inside of the body. Beautiful. But we can actually make this a bit better because now it's kind of glued to the top here and the same down here. So instead of having top and bottom at 0, let's set them to 50 pixels. And so that then creates some space basically around this element. So we added 50 here, down here, and 50 here at the top. Great. Next, let's add some space back here in the heading. So that is the product title. And so now we want some space inside of the element so that we can create some empty space here, which still has some background color, right? So that's why we use padding, because we want that space to be inside of the element and not outside of it. So if it was a margin, then it would look like this, and then the background color would of course not be anywhere here. So because it's outside, right? We want it inside, and so then that's padding. All right, so that's starting to look a lot better. Now maybe let's create some space here between this shipping and this text. And so for that, so for creating some vertical space, I am again using margin bottom. So here in shipping, let's add some margin bottom of, let's say, 20 pixels. Yeah, that looks a lot better. And let's take a look at the final result that we want to achieve. And so you see we have some space here as well. We also have some space below this heading here. And then this unordered list also moved back here inside of the container. because notice that right now these bullets are outside, right? And so let's now fix all of that. So let's start with this one here and giving it 15 pixels. And as always, if your numbers here were different, then that doesn't matter at all. All right. And now some space here between this link and this title, so this heading. And the logical thing to do would probably be to add some margin bottom to the link. Because as I said, the best thing to do is to stick to one of the directions, so to one of the sides, and then always add the margin there. So let's try that. So it's this more info link, but you will see that this will actually not work. So you see we added it and it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is something that I will explain in the next lecture. All right. So what matters now is that this doesn't work because you basically cannot use margins on small elements like anchors, so like this link. And so instead, what we will do now is to add a margin to the top of this element. And so this will then visually look exactly the same way, right? So adding 30 to the bottom of this looks essentially the same as adding 30 to the top of this one. Next, let's then fix these bullet points that are outside of our container element. So margin left, let's say 20 pixels. Yeah, so that looks nice. And now I want to add some space here also between these elements. So that is this details list right here. And so let's select each of these elements that are in there. So dot details list, and then all the li child elements. So this right here is a descendant selector, just like we have learned previously and as we have used many times before. I think we have never used it where one of them is a class selector like this and the other is an element, but of course that's no problem. We can just combine them in any way that we want. And so let's now add that space. Let's say some 10 pixels. And now finally, to finish, let's work a little bit here on this button. So this one. And I'm going to start with some padding here. So adding some space inside of the button. So that already looks a lot nicer, right? But now let's have it go from one side all the way to the other side. So that's something very similar as we did with the image in one of the previous lectures. So we can simply give it a width of 100%. And so now it basically occupies the entire parent element, which is, of course, this complete article element. And now all that we are missing is that border at the top, right? So remember that here in our demo, when we hover it, then it still kind of looks like a button, right? And in order to create that effect, so that kind of illusion, we need this border here at the top of the button. So let's add that. And so it is basically the same border as goes around this article. So let's see what we have there. And we can actually go ahead and copy it. The only thing that we need to then change is that we only want this border at the top in this case. Okay, and now, there we go. So, beautiful. That works just nice. And I think with this, we actually finished this challenge. So it looks just like our demo here. So I think we're done here with this challenge. So great job, well done, and congratulations for writing a lot of code on your own once again. So these are really, really important for you to consolidate your knowledge. So I'm very happy to see that you're still with me here at this point, because that's really great progress. So now that you got the fundamentals of the box model down, let's go one step further and talk about different types of boxes that exist in the box model. And maybe you had already noticed that there are different types of boxes in CSS. So let's inspect this element here to show you what I mean. So this one, for example, and you see that this H2 element occupies all the space that it can occupy. So basically it goes all the way from the left side to the right side, right? And the same is true, for example, for this entire header, of course, for this entire article, and the header as well. And really, most of the elements are like this, but then there are also other elements, so other boxes, so to say, like this one. So here we have this strong element, but you see that it only occupies exactly the space where its content actually is. And the same thing is true, for example, for this image here. So you see it's only really 50 by 50 pixels, which is exactly the size of the content itself. And for example, the same thing here with this anchor tag, which again, you will now see that it occupies exactly the width that is needed for its content. So these types of boxes that only occupy exactly the space that they need for its content is what we call inline boxes. And on the other hand, all these other boxes, so for example, this paragraph or this H3 heading, these we call block level boxes or block level elements. So block level elements or boxes occupy all the space that they can, and they basically create line breaks after them. Or in other words, they cannot be side by side with one another, right? So of course, if they take up all the space they need horizontally, then of course they cannot be side by side. That makes sense, right? So these are the fundamental differences between block level boxes and inline boxes. But there are some more, so let's take a look at a comparison. So here I highlighted all of the block level elements or block level boxes that are on our page right now. And as I already mentioned, these elements are basically formatted as blocks. So big blocks of content which occupies 100% of the parent element's width. And that is true even if the content itself wouldn't actually require so much space. For example, this "What is HTML" heading actually wouldn't need the entire line, right? But it is still a block level element because then they can be stacked vertically one after another by default. Now, one thing that is very important to mention is that the box model applies exactly as I showed you before to block level elements, while the same is not true for inline elements, as we will see in a second. Okay? Now, by default, most of the HTML elements are actually block level elements. So things like the body, main, header, and so on and so forth. So most of the elements really that we used are block level elements. So we can also say that they create block level boxes. All right. Now, one thing that we can do with CSS is to change from inline boxes to block level boxes. And we can do that with the display property set to the value of block. But we will do that in practice in a second. But for now, what I want to do is to look at the inline element and how it's different from block level elements. So here I marked the inline elements with this red border, and you see that as expected, they only occupy exactly the space that is needed for its content. They also don't create any line breaks after or before the element, and so therefore they can simply stay inside of their parent elements without creating any additional space. And this is exactly what makes sense for smaller elements like the strong element, the EM element, or anchor elements, right? We wouldn't want these elements to create a new line and occupy all the width that they can. That just wouldn't make any sense, and therefore that's why we have these different types of boxes. But anyway, now about the box model. As I said, it works differently in inline elements. So for inline elements, the height and width properties do not have any effect. Also, paddings and margins are only applied horizontally, or in other words, on the left and right sides, but not on the top and bottom. And this fundamental difference about how the box model works for inline elements is extremely important to always keep in mind and to never forget, because this is a mistake that I see beginners make all the times, which is basically to not understand why certain properties of the box model do not work as expected when applied to inline elements. So take note of this, as it is very important to always keep in mind. Now, by default, some of the elements that are inline elements, so which create inline boxes, are the anchor, image, strong, EM, the button as well, and many more. Now, just like we can use the display property to make any element a block level element, we can also use display set to inline in order to transform any block level element to an inline element. And actually, let's now go back to our code to see some of these things in action. And let's start by trying to format these links here that are in the header. So let's select them, but I will do that more down. So let me actually create some comments here. So let's say that these are like page sections or something like that. So basically all the big dividing pieces of our page. So we have the body, of course, the container, the main header, the navigation, article, and all of that. And then here is where we start to have our like smaller elements. And these titles here don't really matter. I just want to have like a visual separation inside of the code. Okay, so let's go down here, all the way down. Maybe let's say here. And so I want to select all the links that are inside of the navigation. So let's say navigation and then the links in there. And as always, I should use the link pseudo class to actually style them. Now to see this a little bit better, what happens, let's give them a color, a background color, like orange red. And now I need to manually reload here. Okay, so we got that background color. And now let's start by adding some margin here, just so we see that the box model does in fact not apply the way that we thought it would. So let's say 20 pixels and give it a save. And you see that some margin was added horizontally, so on the left and right side, right? But what did not happen was that vertical space was created. So the top and bottom margins remained unchanged. Now, if we check this out here in the box model in the DevTools, then it will still appear down here. I need some more space here. So you see that the 20 value does still appear, but then here on the colored overlay, so here this orange actually did not create any space, even though it says 20 here, right? And so as you know by now, the reason for that is that the anchor element is an inline element where the box model does not create any vertical space. And the same is true for padding. So padding of 20 pixels. So let's see. And now it does actually look as if some space was created. But that is only true for inside of the element. Because in fact, the anchor content, so the anchor content itself is still in the exact same place. But if this was a block level element, then all of this would have moved down a little bit. So basically the fill area of this element has been expanded and filled with the background color, but no new space was in fact created. Okay? But if we actually want to have that space, and if we want the elements to be one after another, then of course we can change them to block level elements. So that is exactly what I showed you in the slide by using the display property and set it to the value of block. And so this will then render the inline element as a block level element. So what do you think will happen once I save this now? And there we go. Now all of these elements occupy all the width that they can, and also they have now actually also vertical margins between them. Now they are kind of outside of this header element now, because we set the header element to a fixed height. So in one of the previous lectures. So let me show that to you with the overlay. So we need some more space here. And so since we set the height to the header to a specific value of 80 pixels, then the content no longer fits in there. And so the element did not expand in order to fit the content. So that's the reason why usually we don't set a fixed height on elements. So let me go back and change that. So that was just a demo anyway. So yeah, here is the height that we set to 80. So let me comment that out, save it again. And now the element expanded vertically here to account for the additional space that is required. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. But the main point here is that these anchor elements here now do satisfy all the conditions of being a block level element. So the box model applies to them normally, and they occupy 100% of the available width, and so therefore they appear one after another nicely formatted as blocks. All right, so they occupy all the space as we see here, which of course includes the margin. So each of these, if we take a look, has some margin, right? So that is this kind of orange color here. And so that is part of the entire space that the element itself requires. All right, well, let's go back down here and actually turn all of this off, because this was really just a demo. Okay, and now of course we will see the header shrink back to only occupy vertically here the space that it needs. Right, so as we keep adding more and more elements, then this should grow, which is exactly what happened before when these links were bigger. But now they're back to being small, and therefore all that space we had was not required. And now next, let's actually quickly try the opposite and change some block level elements to inline elements. So for example, let's try what happens when we make the list elements as inline. Display inline. Let's remove this actually. And now you see that these three elements are now basically side by side and occupy only the space that they need. And actually, let's bring this back because, well, as I mentioned, the dev tools are really so important, especially for overlaying like these boxes, right? So now the boxes are side by side like this because they are inline boxes. So they no longer create the line breaks after them and only occupy the space that they need. Let's try the same. I'll turn it off here and try the same on the paragraphs. And so that looks even stranger because all the text basically collapsed just into one big line of text, it looks like, right? So again, each of these elements now basically only occupies the space that it needs. All right, but let's remove this because it doesn't make much sense in this situation, but in some situations it actually makes a lot of sense. Now, in many situations, what makes even more sense is to transform a block level element into something called an inline block element. So basically, that's a mix of inline and block level. So let's quickly check out what that means. So here we have a quick summary of both the block level and the inline boxes. So we already know that, so we don't need to go over all that again. But then there's basically a third type of box, which is a mix between these two. And so that is, as I said before, the inline block box. So inline block boxes, they look like inlines from the outside, but they behave like block level elements on the inside. So what that means is that inline block boxes do only occupy the space that they need for the content, and so therefore they do not cause any line breaks. So this is what I mean when I say that the inline block box behaves like an inline box from the outside. However, as I said, it behaves like a block level box on the inside. And so what that means is that the box model applies just as it does for block level boxes. So we can still set heights and width, and we can still use margins and paddings just like on block level boxes or on block level elements. So these are kind of the same, so I keep using them interchangeably. So essentially, inline block boxes really combines the best of both worlds of block level and inline. And in order to create an inline block element, all we have to do is to set the display property to inline block. And that's it. And so let's now see how we do that in practice and some situations where this can be extremely helpful. So let's go back here to our header links. So to this navigation, so that I can show you where an inline block element can be very helpful. So right now there is not a lot of formatting here, so like no spacing. So we need to fix that. So this was somewhere down here, right here. And so let's go back to trying to add some margins without changing anything in the display property for now. So let's say we wanted a margin right of 30 pixels, and this should work because it is a horizontal space, and so that works even on inline elements. But now if I wanted to add a margin top of, let's say, 10 pixels, then nothing will change, right? So it stayed the same, and so that's exactly the behavior that we saw already at the beginning. But now, if we change the display to inline block, then see what happens. So you saw that now we got our space here. And if we check this out, then indeed you can see that orange space on the right side and then the 10 pixels on the top. So the box model is back to being applied as a block level element, but on the outside the elements are still side by side and occupying only the space they need. So behaving like inline elements. So this is a great technique in some situations, even though at this point we also have more modern ways of doing something similar. But in some cases, this will actually be very good to know and a good technique to have in your tool belt. Now, just one final detail is that we should remove that margin right from the last element. So let's select that. Nav a link, and now you will see something new. So this here is a pseudo class, right? But onto that, we can chain another pseudo class because now we want the last child, right? Like this. And then we want to set the margin right back to 0. Okay. So visually that changes nothing, but here we now see that this one no longer has that space on the right side. And many times that's important to do. And so that's why I wanted to show you that we can chain these two pseudo classes like this without any problem. Great. And now, just to finish, I wanted to show you that images are actually inline block boxes. All right. So I said in the beginning that images are actually inline elements, but in fact, they do behave like inline block elements. And we can easily demonstrate this by adding some margin, for example, to this post image here. So if I add a margin of 100 pixels here, then if it was an inline element, it should not create any vertical space. So not here and not here, right? But watch what happens as I save this. And so indeed, you see that all of this vertical space here was added. And so that is proof that indeed it is an inline block element. And the same is true for the fact that we can set width and heights for this element. So if it was a purely inline element, then these two here would also not work, right? So that's also important to note. And let's just set it back to normal here. Okay, so that's it for the type of boxes in CSS. Just as a quick summary, or basically as a takeaway from this lecture, most of the time we will actually leave the display setting alone and simply use the predefined box type, because by default, they do actually make a lot of sense. However, we can use display set to block in order to make a small inline element, for example, occupy an entire line, which is something that we will sometimes need in the real world. Then the other way around, sometimes we don't want a block level element to push all the other elements into a new line. So basically, we don't always want them to occupy all the available blank space that there is to fill. And so in that case, we can set them to an inline element, or probably even more useful, we can set them to an inline block element, because then we can still apply the box model as usual. Let's talk about another extremely important aspect of CSS, which are positioning modes. And this one is one of the more complex lectures of this section, and so make sure to pay good attention. So in CSS, there are a couple of different positioning modes, but the more important ones, and the ones we are going to talk about for now, are the normal flow and absolute positioning. So starting with normal flow, it is simply the default positioning of elements on our page. Or we can also achieve the normal flow by setting position to the value of relative. So in this case, we say that an element is in flow, which basically means that the elements are laid out according to the source code in the HTML. So this is very straightforward. It is simply the behavior that we have been seeing up until this point. So just keep in mind that that is called normal flow. Now, on the other hand, we have absolute positioning, which basically allows us to absolutely position elements anywhere on the page. Now, we can achieve this positioning mode, so we can position an element absolutely by setting its position property to the value of absolute. And so in this case, the element is then removed from the normal flow, and we say that it is out of flow. Now, what happens with this element is that it completely loses any impact on surrounding elements. And in fact, it might even overlap them. So that's something common that happens with absolutely positioned elements. Now, in order to actually position the element that is absolutely positioned, we can use the top, bottom, left, or right properties in order to position that element. And that positioning is going to happen in relation to a relatively positioned container. Now, I know that this sounds kind of confusing, and so let's actually see this happening in practice. So what we're going to do in this lecture is to create a like button that is located outside of our centered container. So Let me show that in the demo. And so here at the very end, we have this like button. And as we expand the page, for example, you see that this element always stays on exactly the same position, right? So it's not impacted by any of the surrounding elements. And that is even better visible if we decrease the page even further. So here we even have that situation where the element actually overlaps this related posts element right here, right? And so you see that this element is not impacting, and it's also not being impacted by any of the surrounding elements. It always just simply stays here in this place, no matter what happens to the rest of the page. And so this is a great example of an absolutely positioned element. Now, where should we actually put the markup for this button? So the HTML? Well, it doesn't really matter, at least for now. So let's just actually put it here at the end of the body. So after any other element. So actually, even after the container. But again, for now, that's not the most important part. We will change this a little bit later. So let's use the button element that we have also used in our coding challenges already. And then here, I'm just going to write like. And then let's just add a nice emoji here, which in Windows you can do by hitting Control, Command, and Space at the same time. And on Windows, you can open up the emoji picker by hitting the Windows key plus the dot. So this is not any VS Code extension. This is simply functionality that is provided by the operating system. So again, Control, Command, Space on the Mac, and Windows plus the dot on Windows 10. So let's just search for heart here. And yeah, VS Code kind of transforms this into this gray symbol here for some reason, but never mind about that. So let's just come here, and our button should be somewhere here now. And so right now it is simply here. So simply after all the other elements, because for now, of course, it is in the normal flow still. So we haven't declared position absolute on it yet. And so therefore it is simply in the flow, and it's simply positioned right after all the other elements. But now let's actually change that. So let's select it here using button. Let's first give it some visual styles. Adding some padding as well. And we can also use that trick of defining the cursor property, as I also showed you in the challenge, and set it to pointer so that we actually get that hand. Right? And so now it looks a little bit nicer. And you see there's also this hover state, which we could of course customize, but let's not spend time on that. But instead, we will now immediately set the position to absolute, just like I showed you in the previous slide. So let's give it a save and see what it looks like. But for now, it still looks pretty similar. And that's because we didn't really position it yet using one of the 4 properties that I also mentioned. So top, left, right, and bottom. And so let's for now actually go with top and set it to 0 here, which is always a good starting point. And let's say left 0 as well. Give it a save. And now it might be gone. Yeah, it is. And so that's because now it is right here. So we set its top position to 0. And so now it's at the very top of the page. Because these pixels here, so these 0 pixels, at least for now, are being counted from the top of the viewport. So of this visible part of the page here. So if we change this to bottom, for example, then it should be here at the bottom of the viewport. So by default, this element is positioned in relation to the viewport, which again is this visible part of the page. Okay, so now it stays here, which is a very weird place for it to be. But what is important to note here is that in fact, this element has been completely taken out of the flow, and it's now even hovering over this content. So it is as if the rest of the content is not even there, and that is becoming even more apparent as we change, for example, the size of the window. And let's go back to where we were, put it back to top, and of course we can also move it to some other position, so it doesn't have to be exactly glued to the top and the left, but we can, for example, move it 50 pixels down and 50 pixels more to the right, counting here from the left side. Okay, so that's the very, very fundamentals of absolute positioning. But what is very important to understand is that these 50 pixels here need to be in relation to something. And so, as I just mentioned a minute ago, by default, these 50 pixels here are in relation to the viewport, so the visible part of the page here in the browser. That's the reason why the element moved down here to this corner when I set the bottom to 0. However, that is usually not what we want. So usually we want to absolutely position the element in relation to some other parent element. And in order to do that, we need to specifically set the position of that parent element to relative. Okay? So in this case, we want this element here to be positioned in the right bottom corner of the page. So of the page and not of the viewport. So let's try that. So let's say bottom 50 pixels. And actually, let's keep this here and just copy it. And then I will comment it out to keep it here as a reference. But what we want is 50 pixels from the bottom and 50 pixels from the right. So again, it moves it to this place in the viewport, but we want it down here. So from the page, right? And so we need to set position to relative on the page, basically. And so that is the body element. So let's do that. Let's go to body, which is right here. And let's set its position to relative. Give it a save. And now as we go down here, then here it is. Great. And let's resize the page a little bit. And now, no matter what happens, the element is always correctly positioned in the bottom right corner of the body. Great. So I hope that made sense. And of course, it doesn't have to be the body always. So we could also position this inside of any other parent element, which is not the body. So let's, for example, try here the container. But in order to do that, the element actually needs to be inside of the container, because otherwise this is not a parent element of the button, right? So let's take this out of here and put it somewhere else. And it doesn't really matter where. All that matters is that it needs to be somewhere inside of this container. So this div element with the container class on it. And I think actually the place where it semantically makes the most sense is here in the header. So the header of the article, so this place here, is actually a common place where you would think a like button makes sense in a blog post like this, right? And so let's put it there, even though visually it's not going to appear there, because again, we are positioning this element absolutely. So if we give it a save, then for now nothing will have changed. It is still right here. But now let's try to add position relative to this container here. So position relative, and there is a typo somewhere. And so now it should be somewhere else. And for now it does look as if it's in the same place, but if we change this now, then you see that it is here in the top right corner now of the container element. So to visualize this, let's inspect the container. And so here the blue part is the content, And so there you see that the like button is now 50 pixels from the bottom and from the right of the container. And again, that is because the container is now the first parent element that has position set to relative. All right. And to make this even more crystal clear, let's take a look at a graphical explanation of this. So let's imagine that we have this kind of yellow element here with the container class, and it has its position set to relative. Then we have another element, which is this one here, so this orange element, and it has its position set to absolute. And it also has the top set to 100 pixels and the left set to 200 pixels. And so therefore, it will be located exactly 100 pixels from the top of its relatively positioned container element and 200 pixels from the left of its, again, first relatively positioned container element. And it's important to mention that it is the first parent element that has position set to relative from which the absolutely positioned element will be placed. Okay? And so I hope that with this visualization, it became even more obvious how absolute positioning works in CSS. And let's actually just try another element as the first relatively positioned container. So let's do that on the header. So this button here is inside of this header. And so we could use this header as the parent element inside of which we want to absolutely position this button. So let's go to post header, place that here, and now here we go. So now here it is. Once again, using the DevTools, so we can check out this entire element. And in fact, it looks like the button is now 50 pixels from the bottom and from the right of its new relatively positioned container. Okay, so let's actually remove this one. So commenting it out and this one as well, because what we really want is what we did in the beginning. So we want it to be positioned in relation to the body. All right, so I hope this made sense. And so as a recap of this lecture, with absolute positioning, you can basically put any element that you want wherever you want it to be on the page, which of course can be quite helpful. Now, what's important is that you don't abuse this newfound power. So don't use this to build complex layouts, for example. Instead, we use absolute positioning for single elements like this button or other small things, just like I will show you in the next video. But in the real world, we don't use this, for example, to position this menu here, like here on the top of the page, or to position, for example, this author image here anywhere on the page. For those things, we will actually use special techniques for building layouts. So just keep in mind that we always don't simply reach for absolute positioning, for example, to build layouts. But all of this will come with practice, and so don't worry too much about it for now. So we talked about pseudo classes before, so now let's talk about pseudo elements, which are a nice little CSS feature that is worth learning about. So pseudo elements are essentially elements that don't exist in the HTML, but that we can still select and style in CSS. And some common examples of that are the first letter of a paragraph or the first line of a paragraph, or of some other text, of course. So let's start with that first example that I gave you of the first letter. So what we can do using a first letter pseudo element is to select the very first letter of this H1 here, which would be this emoji, and then we could format it differently. And so with that, we could fix the fact that this is also italic, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So in the end, it's going to look like this. So no longer italic, and even with some space there on the right side. So let's see how that is going to work. So let's come somewhere down here. And then let's say h1. So we are selecting h1, and then the pseudo element is written using 2 colons. So colon, colon, and then first letter. All right. So pseudo classes are written with just 1 colon, and the pseudo elements are with 2 colons. And so with that, we can easily distinguish between pseudo elements and pseudo classes. So let's style that very first letter. And let's say font style should be not italic, but normal. And let's also give it some margin to the right of 5 pixels. And there you go. Do you see that? Now there's some space and the text is no longer italic. Great. And of course, that would also have worked with any other of the headings and with any other letter. So of course, it doesn't just work with emojis. So let's say we wanted the first letter here of the H2 to be a lot bigger. Let's say font size 60 pixels, for example, or to make it even more visible, 80 pixels, and there you go. So basically we selected this pseudo element, which again is not actually an element in the HTML, but it is as if it was an element that we can select and then style right here. Okay, but this one here is not that interesting. So let's remove it and let's try another one, which is first line. For example, let's try to select all the paragraphs and then in there select and style the very first line. Let's say we actually want the color to be red, just as a demo. And so you see that actually worked just fine. So this is a paragraph and it is the first line, so it's red. The same here, and here, and really everywhere. Right? Now let me actually show you another new selector that you don't know yet, which is the adjacent element selector or the adjacent sibling selector. So a sibling element is basically an element that is part of the same parent. So for example here, this P is a sibling of this one, and of this one, and of this one, and all these other ones, because they are all inside of the same container, which is in this case, this article, right? Now, the adjacent sibling is a sibling that is actually the very next element. So, for example, the adjacent sibling of this H3 is this paragraph here. Okay, so basically the adjacent element is the sibling that comes right after it. And there's actually a selector for that. So what I want to do is to only select the paragraphs that come after the H3s. So that's going to be this one and this one. Okay, so let's say H3 and then plus. So the plus here is the adjacent sibling selector. So if we save that now, then you see that in fact, only the paragraphs that are immediately after the H3, so this one and this one, have been selected. And then in there, of course, only the first line has actually been selected and styled. Okay? But let's actually turn this off. It's not that helpful, but I still want to give you the reference here of first line and maybe even more importantly, of the adjacent sibling selector, which in some cases is actually quite important. All right, but now let's actually use the probably most used and most important pseudo element, which are the after and the before pseudo elements. So the after pseudo element creates a pseudo element that will automatically be the very first child of the selected element. And I'm sure that that sounds quite strange, but this can actually be very useful for some small cosmetic style for which we don't want to necessarily add a new element to the HTML. So let me show you what I mean by that. And it's easiest to show you in the demo. So what I'm talking about is this yellow small thing here. Let's give us some more space so we can actually see it. So essentially I'm adding this small cosmetic style here. So simply saying that this is a top article. All right. And so for this very small, let's say thing, we don't need to add a whole new element into our HTML. I mean, of course, we could do that, but this is a good use case to show you the before or the after pseudo elements. All right, let's put it back and go back here. And so, yeah, so remember that this element here is close to this h1 here. And so what we will do is to create the after pseudo element basically after the h1. So I will just write the code and then it will be a bit easier to understand. So colon, and then after. And now the first property that is mandatory to specify here is the content property. So we specify content, and then here we need to write something. And it can actually just be an empty string, so just this empty text like this. But in this case, we want top. Okay? But even if you don't want any text in your pseudo elements, you still have to define the content property. And actually, at this point, this pseudo element should already be visible in our page. So let's give it a try. And it looks like it's not there yet. But let's figure out right here. Oh, and actually, it is here. You see that? It's here in the h1. So we want it in the h2, actually. And there it is. So there is this element that we just created, and we will style it in a little bit, because like this, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But here you can actually see it even in the DevTools, and as you hover it, it is right there. Okay, but let's now style it a little bit further. Let's give it some background color. I'm going to use some nice yellow with this code here, 𝗦𝗣𝗜𝗖𝗬E. All right. And so now this looks more like a real element. Then we can also change the font size. For example, we can make it bold. So let's see. And that looks a little bit nicer already. And now let's give it some padding. Now, by default, any pseudo element is actually an inline element. And so if we want to give it any padding, we want the box model to apply to it normally, right? And so in order to do that, we need to render this element as an inline block box. So display inline block. And so this is actually one of the great use cases of using inline block. And so take note of that maybe. Now let's add some padding here. Let's say 5 pixels to the top and 10 pixels to the sides. Nice. So that's already looking quite good. But now we need to add the final piece of the puzzle, which is to actually position it in a meaningful place. So notice how right here, the element is like kind of at the end of the element. So at the end, and half of the element is outside of it. So, well, here in our example, let's give our h2 just temporarily a background color here, so we can see what's happening. So background color orange. Okay, and so now where we want this pseudo element to be located is here a bit outside. So first let's put it here in this corner, and then from that we will move it outside. So how do you think we can achieve that? Well, the answer to that is absolute positioning. All right. So the third thing that we need to do in order to absolutely position an element is to first give the parent element inside of which we want actually the positioning to happen the position relative. Remember that? And so in this case, that's going to be this h2 element. So position relative. And now we are ready to absolutely position this element. So position absolute. And let's put it at the top. And just to test it for now, let's put it on the left. So this will be the top left corner. And indeed, that worked beautifully. It's right here. Just notice what happened if we turned off the position relative here in the h2. Then this would immediately move up here to the very top of the page, right? And so that's why we can never forget position relative on the parent element inside of which we want this to happen. But now we want it here at the right side. So right here. And now let's actually move it out a little bit. So move it up and move it to the right. Okay, and the reason why I'm doing that is so that I can show you something that we haven't also talked about yet, which is negative length. So if we specify it here 25 pixels to the right, it would move from the right here in this direction to the left, basically. Right? So 25 pixels from the right into this direction. However, if we set a negative value, it will move in the opposite direction. And so now it is right here. So outside of the h1. Well, at least partially, right? So not the h1, but the h2, of course. Then at the top, let's do the same. Let's say minus 10 pixels. And it could be even a bit more, I guess. Let's say minus 15. And so that looks a bit better. Okay. And so now we can get actually rid of this one here. And there we go. So that looks just like this one, right? Well, it's a bit different. This one is a bit more up, so we can move it back down, let's say 10. And also the color is black. So let's do that here. And let's stay consistent and use hexadecimal. And so to make it black, it's 0, 0, and 0 all the way. And so now let's see. And that looks exactly the same. With the only difference that it's actually 4, 4, 4, but that doesn't really matter. And once again, this element that we just created and styled does exist here kind of in the HTML tree that we can see here in the DevTools. But of course, in our own HTML, it is nowhere to be found here close to this h2, right? So CSS, once we declare it here, will then automatically create it and will put it here so that we can style it. So the styles, of course, then appear down here in the styles panel. And here are the usual values of the box model. Okay, and so this is how we work with pseudo elements in HTML. Now there's also the before, but actually that would look exactly the same way. The difference is that after will basically become the very last child element of the one that we are selecting here, while before will become the very first child element. So if we change this here to before, then you see that here it switched position. But since we are positioning this element in an absolute way, that doesn't matter at all how the result looks like. But since we are positioning this pseudo element in an absolute way anyway, it doesn't change how it looks like, no matter if we use after or before. Nice. So with this, we actually finished this part of the CSS fundamentals. So great job and well done for still being with me here, even as the content is getting a little bit more complex and maybe a little bit harder to understand. But that's just part of the learning journey. And so just make sure that you really understand everything that I show you here by practicing and by always reviewing the code for each lecture. Now, the next 2 lectures will be about some developer skills that are important for you as you start your journey as a web developer. And then after that, we have one final coding challenge for the section so that you can practice what we just learned over these last couple of videos. So the next few videos are very important and very exciting, I think. And so see you there soon. One of the most important messages that I want to get across in this course is that you do not have to memorize every single CSS property that there is, or that you learn in this course, and also that you can actually start writing your own CSS even when you don't know everything yet. So for beginners like you, it's really important to be aware of the fact that it is okay not to know everything, and that you can always Google when you don't know anything or read the documentation. And so in this lecture, I want to quickly show you some techniques that I use to Google stuff that I don't know, and also how to read documentation in order to learn something about a property that you don't know yet or that you don't remember how exactly to use. And let's start with a hypothetical but real-world scenario. So let's imagine that you build a form on your web page, and that form has a button. But now you don't remember how you can actually add like that mouse cursor to the button. So when your users hover the button, you want it to look something like this. So with this cursor here happening. But again, you don't remember how to do that. But again, you might not remember how to actually do that. And this is really no problem at all. So you can always Google something if you don't know how to do it and read the documentation as well. So in this case, this is what I would do. So I would Google CSS. And so the first word that I always use when I'm searching something related to CSS is CSS. And then let's say CSS property to add a mouse cursor to button. So this is basically what you want to achieve, right? And then in the search results, usually you want to look for stackoverflow.com. So Stack Overflow is basically a website where millions of users have posted tens or maybe hundreds of millions of questions about all kinds of programming. And that includes CSS. So this W3 Schools is usually not a good reference, so don't use that. Then there's also CSS Tricks, which is also very good. And down here, there is developer.mozilla.org, which is actually the MDN documentation, which we will check out also in a minute. But for now, I'm interested in here is Stack Overflow, which again is like a Q&A site where people can ask questions and then other users help them. So here we have a question, how to change the cursor into a hand when a user hovers over a list item. Now, you are not really interested in the list item, but the rest of the question is kind of what you're looking for, right? So let's try to take a look at our responses here. And here is the most popular one, and which was also voted as correct by the original poster. So here what they do is to basically add cursor set to pointer to the element which should get that hand, right? And in fact, that is actually the solution. So now we can just copy the solution, or if you think that is a bad practice, well, then you can just go to your button and write it manually. But what matters is that now you solved your problem simply by Googling it. All right? So again, don't feel bad for having to Google when you don't know anything. I do that every single day. So really, developers never know everything. We just know that something exists, and we also know how to then look it up. So of course, you need to know the fundamentals about how CSS actually works, but again, you don't need to memorize every single property. You just need to know that it is possible to add a mouse cursor to a button, but you don't have to always know how exactly to do that. Okay, and now let's try another example. And returning actually here to our page, let's imagine that we wanted to center all of these links inside of the navigation. So here we have the navigation, and here we have these links. And so we want to center them. So let's try to do that on our own. And the first approach might be to select these anchor elements and set the text align to center. Right? So I'm pretty sure we selected them somewhere. And here they are, actually. And so let's do what I just explained. So let's try text align and set to center. Let's give it a save. Maybe I have to reload manually. Okay, but now you see that nothing changed. So let's inspect this. And well, we need some more space here. All right. And so selecting them, of course, we can see that text align center is indeed set, but still nothing happens. All right. However, if we think about this, this actually makes sense, because what text align does is to basically center some text inside of an element. Now, these elements here are inline elements, and therefore the only space that they occupy is exactly the space that the content needs, right? And so the width of these elements is exactly as wide as it needs to be to fit the content. Therefore, it is not possible to center anything inside of them, because there is simply no empty space inside of which the element could be centered. Okay, so having arrived at that conclusion, maybe now you don't know how to actually solve the problem, because you still want all these links centered here. So let's try to Google that once again. Let's say CSS, how to center anchor elements. Okay, and now again you want to be looking for stackoverflow.com, and this one looks exactly what we are looking for. So how do I center an anchor element in CSS? And many times you actually need to open up various questions, because not always their question is exactly the same as yours. Now, in this case, we actually have the correct solution right here. So what they say is add the text align CSS property to its parent style attribute. Well, this part of the style attribute is not really relevant, because remember I told you not to use style like this, right? But instead using a class, and that is also not really important. What matters is that what we need is this. So we need text align center set to the parent. All right. So let's then put that into our code. And so we want this not here, but we want it in the nav. So let's go look for the nav. It should be somewhere at the top. Here it is. And now text align set to center. And here we go. So now these elements are actually centered inside of the parent container. Okay. And in this case, this works because these elements are inline elements. Or actually in this case, inline blocks. But what matters is they do not occupy the entire width of the parent. And so when we want to center a bunch of elements like this, no matter if inline or inline block elements, then all we need to do is to add the text align center property on the parent element. Okay. Now maybe you wanted to learn a little bit more about this property. And so let's now use the MDN documentation. Now this is not an official documentation, but it's still what most developers use to look up CSS properties. So we write MDN, then CSS, because on MDN there are many different languages, and then let's say text align. And then here the first result is already what we're looking for. So developer.mozilla.org. And so here there is basically a description and also some demos about different values for this property. So the text align CSS property sets the horizontal alignment of the content inside a block element or table style box. Okay, and so that's exactly what we did. So we set it here, text align center, on a block element, right? And previously we tried to set it on an inline block element, and there it didn't do anything. And so we could also have gotten that here from the documentation. Then here we can click on some different demos. So of course left, right, center, and there is even justify. Then here are all the different values that exist. And then here's a bunch of even more stuff that you probably don't even need. So a lot of more examples. And this one is also important. Well, not in this case, but in some more modern properties, here we can see the browser compatibility of this specific CSS property. So in this case, it's not that relevant, but sometimes you might want to check that out as well. Now another one, for example, we can check for border, because this one is a little bit complex. And so let's say you want to set a border, for example, a dotted one or a wavy border, but you don't remember exactly the syntax. All right. So here you have a couple of examples once again, and you can click them and check them out. And here you can also learn, as I mentioned before, that border is actually a shorthand property for the border width, style, and color. And then here again, you have a bunch of examples. And yeah, for all the properties that you want, you can check out the documentation to learn exactly what values you can give them and how they work. Okay, and I think with this, I showed you enough so that you can on your own now try to Google some questions that you might have and also read documentation about some properties that you might not know exactly how they work. And this is a really important developer skill that you need to learn as you start becoming a CSS and also HTML developer. Now, another very important skill that you will need as you become a web developer is to debug your own code and to ask questions in case that you cannot solve certain problems. So in programming, we say that a bug is basically an error or a mistake. And so basically debugging our code means finding and fixing errors in code. All right. And so let's now pretend that there is some error in your code. And in HTML, the most common error, so the most common bug that occurs, is that some elements remain unclosed. So that can easily happen even with VS Code automatically closing elements for us. But still, sometimes with copy-paste or with some other things that happen, sometimes we end up deleting these closing tags, and then some error might appear. So let's say that for some reason we never closed the strong element here, and then our page is going to look like this. And of course, for this example, we need to pretend that we don't know about this bug, right? Anyway, this doesn't make any sense. So if we just introduce the bug and then we render our page, then all of a sudden our page looks like this, right? And this might be a little bit scary because you look at your page and it looks very wrong. This is not what you intended, right? So how to fix this? Well, in this case, it is actually very simple. All you need to do is to take a look at this result here, so at this page, and actually figure out where the bug started. So the problem here is clearly that all the text is bold where you don't want it to be. And so to debug this code, you need to look where the code is not bold. So up here, for example, the text is not bold. And so the bug must appear somewhere below this. Then this one here is bold, but that's simply because it's an H2. Then here you see some more text that is also not bold. And then from here on, all of a sudden, everything is bold. And so that means that your bug must be somewhere here. And so then you can move back to your HTML and notice that, oh, you did not close this element. And then it's very simple. You just come here, close your element, give it a save, and you're back. And the same can of course happen on all other kinds of elements. So let's say for some reason you overwrote this closing tag here. Then you take a look, and again everything is suddenly bold and also bigger and blue. And so maybe immediately from the color and the bold text, you can see that this now looks like the H3. So again, you can then come to your code, notice that there is a bug, and fix it. Now, one of the bugs that is quite common is that, for example, here you close the li and leave the content outside. So something like this. And then as you check your page, something looks very off, right? But then again, it is just a matter of going to the place in the HTML that corresponds to this problem and then figure out what happened. So in this case, that's pretty clear. You have an extra closing li. So just close that, and we are back to safety here. Now, what if this happens in like a bigger element? So let's say here in the aside. If we delete this, then the error might not be that apparent. So you see, it's not that apparent. All that happened is that this text here is suddenly inside of this aside element. So now imagine that you created this bug in your code very early on, even before you actually started writing the CSS. And so in that case, you never noticed that this was happening. And then as you started writing the CSS, you suddenly noticed that this is off, but you don't really remember writing the HTML. So you're not sure what might be wrong here. And so a great solution in that case is to actually use an HTML validator tool. So that will basically allow you to see if your HTML is valid or not. So to do that, let's copy all of the code here. At least that, I think, is the easiest way of doing this. Then here we need to Google HTML validator, and then usually it should be this very first result. But I will also have a link to this HTML validator on my resources page, as I showed you before. So here we can validate by introducing a URI. So that's something like a URL. We can manually upload a file, or we can simply paste the code that we just copied here. And so again, that is, I think, the easiest solution. So let's click on check. And now actually we have a couple of errors. So not just the one that we were looking for, but you see that down here actually is that unclosed element aside. So that is the bug that we just on purpose introduced. So let's fix that here. All right. Then here we have another error, which is end tag div scene, but there were open elements. So this error is actually related to this one, and this is quite common to see in a validator. So that one error in the code actually then creates multiple right here. Okay, so these two were fixed by what we just did here. But then here apparently we have some other errors in our code. So let's actually fix those. So in line 131, we have the duplicate attribute width. So let's fix that. And actually, that's true. So we have width and then width again. And of course, this should be height. So hide like this. And then finally there is yet another one. So in line 137, attribute height not allowed. And actually the problem here is that this is misspelled. So that's a stupid error. So it's not TH, but HT like this. So you see that actually even before on purpose introducing a bug, we had invalid HTML all along. So now I'm copying it again. So then here I will Command or Control A to select everything, delete it, and paste it again. Then check, and now we have no errors or warnings to show. Okay, so that is the HTML validator. So a very useful tool. But let me now actually show you another tool, which is a div checker. And a div checker can be very helpful to compare your own code with my code that I actually code here in the videos. So in case you run into any problem where your page looks different than mine, probably something is wrong in your code. And so in that situation, you can compare your code automatically to mine, basically. So let's say that for some reason, instead of using the A element here, you used link. And link doesn't make any sense here. But, well, with anchors, we are actually creating hyperlinks. And so for some reason, you might have made a mistake of, instead of using A, using link, because you might have thought that this is what creates links. And so now somehow your code here is not clickable and it's black instead of blue. And actually, let's go back to our CSS here, and in the nav, remove this piece of code that we added in the last video, right? But anyway, now let's actually compare this code with my code. So with the final code in this section. So let's search for div checker like this. And then you can simply use divchecker.com. So here you will put your code. So again, Command or Control A, then copy, then paste. And now here on this side, you need the other code, or actually the other way around. So here you want the original. So let's delete that. And here your changed text. And so let's now come to the code that you downloaded. So this repository. And then I have the final folder here. And so this is what you can use this code for. So to compare it with your own code. So we are in this section of the CSS fundamentals, and we're interested in the index. And so in order to open this up, we can very simply drag it onto the VS Code icon here in the menu bar. And so this is basically the final code of this section. So again, selecting everything, copying it, then I can paste that here, and then somewhere there should be the Find Different button. So by the time you are watching this video, this interface might look a little bit different, but the basic idea should still be there, that you have two text boxes and then some button to compare them. So just click that, and then you see the differences nicely marked in here. So in the original, of course, we have the A element, while you, for some reason, had the link. Okay, and in this case, that's the only difference. Or actually, here is some other one. So the closing tag, and here is just closing. So let me actually fix that as well. So here, of course, it should be A. Let's put that back. And then here, there's also something wrong in the content. So closing tag, here it should be the closing tag. Let's see if there is something else. But, yeah. Here are these bugs that we just solved also. So previously we had with twice, right? And so we fixed that already. And so here we are good, and this was wrong previously. So in the final file, it was actually still wrong. Okay. But besides that, that's it. Okay. Then down here, we have access again to that text. So we can do some changes here. So let me just introduce a couple more, just so we could see how that looks like then. So this li here, let's say we didn't close this somehow. Let's say that here inside of the footer, we actually closed not footer, but header for some reason. Okay, find the difference. And then here you see that it looks very different. So even if you have just empty lines, it will still show up here in the div checker. All right, so that's all the changes that we just introduced. Now, okay, great. So div checker and HTML validators are two extremely helpful tools to debug your HTML code. But now let's go actually to CSS, because there are also some potential bugs that might happen there. Now, one of the most common sources of bugs in CSS are some conflicts between selectors. So let's select these links here once again, and keep in mind that they are inside of the nav, which is inside of the main header. Okay, so we have the nav a link here, but for some reason, let's imagine that we selected these links also somewhere else and then added some different style there. So let's say somewhere here in the middle of the rest of the code, and here we wrote a different selector. So let's say that here we wrote main header, and then inside of that the nav, and then inside of that the A, like this. And here we set the color actually to red. Okay, but we still want our color to be blue. But now if we reload this, then our text is actually red. So we have two selectors which both define the color and they both apply. And so if before you wrote this and only later you then wrote this piece of code and wanted the text actually to be blue, then you might not be understanding what actually happens here. Well, the color is actually not the perfect example here. So let's play instead with the margin top. So let's say that for some reason you defined the margin top to be 100 pixels for the link, but then a bit later again you write this rule here where you actually only want the margin top to be 10 pixels. So you are writing this rule, then you give it a save, and all of a sudden it looks like this. So you have 100 pixels. So what is happening? Well, let's inspect. And well, you see that both of these selectors apply, of course, so both of the rules, but the margin top that does actually apply is this one here in this longer selector. So as a rule of thumb, besides the rules that we already learned before about selector priority, if one selector is way more complex than the other, then many times it's actually the more complex one that gets applied. Okay, and so that's why I also told you before that you should avoid writing a selector like this. So a very complex one. So keep your selector simple like this one, and that will then avoid creating bugs like this. Okay, now technically here, if we take a look at the selector specificity, you see that it has 1, 2, right? So memorize that, 0, 1, 2. And here we have 0, 2, 2. And so these numbers are larger, and therefore this is the one that actually gets applied. Now, I mentioned before not to worry about specificity because that gets too complex. But basically, the higher the numbers, the more that selector will apply. All right. So don't write selectors like this, and instead keep their specificity low. Okay. And if you follow the rules that I showed you about the priority of selectors, then you should be fine. Another common problem that might happen is that for some reason you misspell a property name, and that happens all the time. So let's say that instead of write, you wrote this, then you give it a save, and of course the element is not positioned where you expected it to be. So in that case, the simplest thing to do is simply to inspect that element and then check out what happened there. Now, in the case of a pseudo element like this, you will actually have to then click here to open the element itself, and then from there you can select the pseudo element. And then you can simply check out the properties here, and you will then find this icon here, which means unknown property name. And so from that, you will immediately know that here you misspelled something. So then you come here to your code, fix that, and you're good to go again. So this one is also more common than you thought, and so doing what I just did here is always a good idea. And in general, it is also always a good idea to always experiment with this code that you have here in the DevTools and play around with it and, for example, tweak values here. So instead of, for example, experimenting with the H2 font size here in the code, you can simply come here to this value, click it, and then on your keyboard, you can use the up and down keys, just like it says here, actually, so in that tooltip. So with this, you can see real life how these values changed, and you can also use shift and up and down, and then it will increment in steps of 10. So this is very, very helpful. I do this all the time when I'm experimenting with different values. Okay? And if for some reason you somehow really cannot fix your code, then of course, again, you can use the diff checker to compare your CSS code with the one that I show in the video. So the final code of the section that is in the repository that I just showed you before. Now, finally, one error that I see beginners make all the time is to not correctly link the CSS file in the first place. So remember that that happens up here in this link, and sometimes, for some reason, students mess up the path to the CSS file. That's also because sometimes we might want to put this into a different folder, so just like we did with the images, and then you need to correctly, of course, write the path in relation to this HTML file. So in case that no CSS at all is applied to your page, then the first thing that you need to check is if this link here is correct. So if your style sheet was correctly linked to your HTML. Okay? So this is how you fix some of the most common bugs in HTML and CSS. But if for some reason you really cannot fix any of the bugs that you found, even using all of the tools that I just showed you in this video, then of course you can ask a question in one of the platforms that I just showed you, and in particular on Stack Overflow, or you can also post a new question here in the Udemy Q&A. Now what matters here is that you always post all of your code to a CodePen first. So instead of copy and paste all your code to Stack Overflow or into the Udemy Q&A, please make it easy for the person who will help you, and instead paste all your code into a CodePen. So we have already used CodePen for the challenges, but just to make sure, well, where is it now? Ah, here. So start coding, or you can just write /pen. And then, again, grab all your code, put it here in the HTML, and then all your CSS right here. And in case you have JavaScript, you can also put it here. Then you save it, for which you will need an account, and then you just copy the URL and paste it either to Stack Overflow or to the Udemy Q&A section. Okay? All right. And I think that's it about the basic skills of debugging and asking questions. So of course, debugging can go a lot deeper than just this, but for now, I just wanted to give you an overview of what debugging is and how it works. And now to wrap up this section, let's continue building our coding challenge that we have been building in the next video. Welcome back to the last coding challenge of this section. And as always, we will keep working on our same project. So this is how we left it after coding challenge number 2. And so as always, keep this as a starting point, which hopefully you have on some CodePen or somewhere on your computer. And if not, the link to this code will be in this lecture. And what I want you to do is basically to change this to this. And essentially, there are only 2 big changes. First, we have this sale label here in this top left corner of the element. And then also down here, we have basically these 6 available colors in which we can buy the shoe. So I want you to build this part here and this. So this sale is very similar to something that we did before. So hopefully you remember that's this. Okay. But in this case, you actually don't need to use a pseudo element for that. You can simply add a element, for example, a paragraph for the sale, and then position it here just like we did it in one of the previous lectures. Now, maybe you're noticing this detail that in this text, there is some space between the different characters or these letters here, right? And so there is a CSS property which allows you to do that. And what I want you to do is to Google that. So I want you to use Google to figure out how you can add that space, a little bit like I showed you in the developer skills lecture about Googling. So now you can apply that as well. Okay. So that is one of the things that you need to do. And the other one is this here. So basically what you will need to do is to create an element, and then inside of that element, which can be a simple div. So inside of that element, then you need to create 6 more elements. And these can also be divs if you like. And then all you need to do is to give each of them a color and put them side by side using a neat little trick that we actually also learned in one of the lectures. And in particular, it was the lecture about the types of boxes, if I remember correctly. So this was a nice little trick that we used there. And so you can use that here as well. And if you don't remember it, as always, there is absolutely no problem if you need to go back to our code and look up exactly how we did that. And the same, of course, goes for this technique here. So I don't expect that you memorize all the techniques that I show you here, but if you can look them up in your code and translate them to a different situation, that already would be an amazing achievement. Okay? So if you can just do that, then please go ahead and pause the video now, and I see you once you're done. All right, back to work here. And let's start with the sale label. So as I said, I will simply add a paragraph somewhere. And since we will position it absolutely, it doesn't really matter where it is. But I will just put it here close to the price and the shipping, because semantically, that's where it makes sense to be located. So let's give it a class of sale. And then we want the text of sale as well. And then let's close this. And now here in our CSS, let's put it also close to this shipping. So down here. And let's start by adding some visual styles to it. So some background color, for example. And here you could have just used any red color that you wanted, for example, using the VS Code color picker. And I also did that. And so the color I came up with is EC2F2F, just like this. Let's Let's actually go there. All right. Then let's worry about the text. So let's make it white like this. Give it a font size of 12 pixels and make it uppercase. And make it bold as well. So font weight bold. Let's give it some padding. 7 pixels at the top, 15 left and right. And again, these don't really matter, but many times it's a good idea to have the horizontal padding to be kind of double of vertical. So that's a good rule of thumb that many times looks very good. And now the next step is that actually we want this element only to occupy the space that it actually needs. So there are two techniques for that. Well, actually just one, but you could also kind of achieve this in a different way. So the best way to do this would be to set the display to inline box, actually inline block. And so now indeed, just like any inline element, the box only occupies the space of its content. Okay, so this is the correct solution, but let's comment this out to show you another solution. So you could have also kind of guessed the width of this element if you wanted. Let's say 100 pixels, and then we could adjust it. So let's say just 80 pixels, or just 50 pixels maybe, or 40 even. And then once you kind of got close, you can then just say text, align, center, because now there is actually enough space around the element inside of which the text could then be centered. Okay, so when we have actually a width, then we are no longer in that situation where text align center doesn't make sense in an element like we had before here with these links. Remember that? So I think like 2 lectures ago. But anyway, this is not the preferred solution, but it is something that we could also have done. So I found it interesting to also show you that. And so now it's time to actually absolutely position this element right here. So let's remember that the first thing that we need to do in order to absolutely position an element is to define in relation to what parent element this element should be positioned. And so on that parent element, we set position to relative. So in this case, that should be quite easy, right? That is simply this product here. So this article with the class of product. And so this is where now we want to set position to relative. And so now we can go back here and say position absolute and set the top and left to 0 just to get started. Okay. And now we can kind of guess the values where this should be. So let's say like minus 15 pixels. That can be a little bit more, like 17. Yeah. So now it's like nicely in the middle. And now let's move it also like 30 pixels to the left. So that's not quite centered yet. Let's say 35. Well, let's actually make it 34, so it's exactly double of the top. All right, so with this, we are almost done with this part. All that's missing is this extra space between the characters, right? So to give it this extra touch, and also because I wanted you to practice your Googling skills. So what I would have Googled is CSS add space between characters, or you could have written letters as well. But here you actually immediately get the result. So letter spacing. But I'm more interested in here, usually in a Stack Overflow reply or this documentation of MDN. So here we have letter spacing, which looks like something we want. And so here, indeed, we get, as always, a couple of different examples. And so, yeah, this is the property that we're going to use. So I'm copying it. Let's put it here close to these styles. And I'm setting it to 2 pixels. And yeah, that actually looks a lot nicer. Now we just need to like push it even a bit more to the side there, like this, to center it. And yeah, that's it. So we are done with this part. So now let's quickly add those colors here. And as I said previously, we will basically create a div, so a container without any semantic meaning. And then in there, I will create 6 more divs, and then each of them will get its own background color. So that should be right here after the link. Right, so after the link and before these product details. So a div, and I'm calling it the colors. Let's just immediately close it so we don't forget it, because this editor is not as good as VS Code, but it's still quite helpful to actually use CodePen for something like this. And now we will just create another div in here, color. And then actually this doesn't have any content at all. All right. So this is something we didn't really do before. And so let me just explain and show you how we will do it. So we want 6 colors, so I'm just copy pasting it 6 times. So yeah, let's put that right here at the end. So just like in the HTML. So the colors class is not really important, I think. So let's just start by defining each of the squares. So each of these. So basically we make them a square by giving them a certain height and then a width, which is the same. So let me show that to you. The first thing we should do is to give them a background color to make it easier to see it. The first one I think was black. All right, but right now they are not visible because they don't have any content. But if we give them a height and a width, then they will become visible. So let's do that. Height, 22 pixels. And so now immediately they got a height, and then they occupy all the space that they can because they are block level elements by default, right? So they are divs, and therefore that is by default a block level. But now if we specify their width to be the same, so it looks like a square, then, well then of course, they no longer do that. Okay, so of course we are still far away from the final result, but in order to continue effectively, let's now give each of them a different color. So how can we do that? Well, I will actually add another class to each of them, and that is completely possible. Remember that we are allowed to give each element more than one class. So I showed you that before. So the way we do that is to add a space and then simply add another one. So the first one was black, then blue, red, yellow, green, and brown. And so, well, in the first one, we actually don't need to do that because they are black already, all of them. And so we can then basically override that in all the other ones. So let's call this one the color blue. And then let me just copy paste that a couple of times. So red, yellow, green, and brown. And now we will, of course, have to select all of them right here. So again, you could have come up with any blue color that you'd like. My choice was this one, 2F6EE2. So let's see. And indeed, now it is blue. I will just copy this a couple of times. Okay. So red, yellow, green, and brown. So not here, but here. Here, let's use the same red that I had before. Actually. And then the yellow was F0BF1E. Green is 90CC20. And finally, the brown is 885214. And there you go. There we have our 6 different colors. Now all we need to do is to put them side by side. So how can we do that? Well, there is a neat trick that we learned before, which is to change the display property of these elements to inline block. So we will now set all of these 6 elements, so all of them which have the class of color, to inline block. Because like this, they will only occupy the space that they need, and they will also not create any line breaks after them. And so that is exactly what we want. Now, we could not use inline because then the height and width wouldn't really work as expected, or at least they shouldn't. And you see that indeed it doesn't work. So it needs to be inline block because remember, height and width do not apply to inline elements. And now all we need is a small margin to the right of each of them of, let's say, 12 pixels. And there we go. It's a bit too much maybe. So 10 pixels. And that's it. So that's all we need to do. Well, actually we are missing like some space here after this anchor. And remember how we actually already had this problem before. So we tried to add some space, so some margin bottom to this anchor, but it didn't work. And so the workaround was to then add that space at the top of this heading. Remember that? So that's why here this details title has the margin top. And by the time we didn't understand why adding margin bottom to this anchor element didn't work. But now we actually do. So let's do that as well. So that's right here. So let's add a margin bottom here of 30 pixels, which will still not work. But again, we now know why it doesn't work. And the reason is that the anchor element is an inline element. And on inline elements, the top and margin bottoms do not apply. So to fix that, once again, we need to display this as an inline block. So easy enough, display inline block, and there you go. There we have our 30 pixels now nicely displayed. Okay, and I think with this, our solution looks exactly the same as our demo. So we are done now, as it looks. Yep, so seems so. And so, yeah, that actually wraps up this introduction to CSS section. So one more time, congratulations for reaching this first part of the course. And you now have all the fundamentals of HTML and CSS that you need in order to start building layouts, which is actually one of the main parts of CSS. So there's a whole section waiting about that. And so once you're done reviewing everything that we did here, I will see you in that next section once you are ready.